do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion. It can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Murdocracy, a podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of News Corp, the most influential media company in the Western world. I'm Cam Wilson.
And I'm Sami Shah.
Sammy, how are your eyes?
Well, they are working now, which is a huge change from basically most of my life. I've been wearing glass spectacles since I was 6 years old, and now, thanks to the miracles of modern science, I no longer need to do that. I can just roam around with naked eyes, like it's some kind of pervert.
Are people in your life finding it hard to adjust to you without glasses?
So strange. My daughter keeps freaking out because she says my eyes are too big now because my glasses used to shrink them, obviously, because of the refraction.
Yeah.
And everyone else around me, they do a lot of that thing where I went to a comedy club and there's a bunch of comedians and they all were looking at me. And a bunch of them came up turn by turn individually and they'd be like, "Did you shave?" And I'm like, "Dude, you can see the beard on my face." Like, really? That's the change you think happened here? So, people are attentive, but not as attentive as you think they are.
What is there anything that you're looking forward to doing now that you don't have glasses? Give us a bit of perspective, like, because I know you had very, very bad vision. What are the things that, like, having bad vision like that stop you from doing?
Well, I mean, okay, look, there's a few things that it turns out I can't ever do again anyway, which are bungee jumping, skydiving, and high-impact sports like getting punched in the face. And that's largely because my retina's so stretched from having weak eyesight my whole life. Those are out for me.
You were really into all three of those.
As you know, I'm a hardcore extreme sports person, But the things that I'm like, okay, it's a little stuff, man. It's like not having glasses fogging up when you put a face mask on.
Oh, yeah,
that's such a huge one now. It's just, being able to look in the shower at what you're washing, It's the little things that you'll notice end up becoming just miraculous when you're there. Every haircut is no longer a surprise for me when I put my glasses on at the end of it. So, yeah, it's nice.
Well, Sammy, it's good to hear that it doesn't sound like it's affected your podcasting at all. You haven't lost a step. You still got it. So who knows what kind of new insights your vision will bring.
Yeah, what if now I'm done with podcasting? I'm a TV man now.
Maybe we can go to vodcast or something. I don't know. We're in room for expansion. The other thing I was thinking about this week, Sammy, is are you ready for a new variant of COVID?
Oh man, can you imagine? We just got out of lockdown in Melbourne. I knew it. When lockdown ended this time, I thought, you know what's going to happen is next year again from August to November, we're going to go back into lockdown because that seems to be the annual pattern now for Melbourne. And sure enough, we got a new variant. By the time it comes here, it'll be next August or so. And yeah, let's do this. Let's do it. We know how to do this now. We got this.
I am just like, I mean, I feel a deep guilt because we as Western society, a Western country, have not done everything we can to get vaccines into places like the global South, into Africa, and look,
Queensland, right? Yeah,
yeah. And like that's where that's where the variant is coming from. But also it means that now like all these countries are shutting their doors to African countries. And it's just, Australia is one of the richest nations in the world. We started off with our vaccine rollout really slow. We've caught up and now we're one of the more vaccinated countries in the world. So that's great. But then we've got the AstraZeneca vaccine, which kind of everyone started to turn their nose up at. And we're producing it here, but we're stopping production at the end of the year. Meanwhile, there's countries like, we've been talking about Africa, but even places like PNG, which they've had, barely any vaccinations.
Absolutely.
And they are so vulnerable to something like this, particularly a new, more contagious variant. I don't know. It's just like, can we
There
get some
was
good news?
there was a really interesting thing I saw online, which is that because of South Africa's experience with dealing with AIDS, their
Mm.
gene sequencing skills and investment in gene sequencing is so much further than the rest of the world that they were
Oh.
able to detect the new variant, as being called, earlier than any other country might have been able to detect it. And so they feel like, why are they being punished now for this? Like, by detecting it early, now they're just guaranteeing that they get locked out of the other countries with border closures and
Yeah.
stuff. But it is also one of those things where the efficiency might be hurting them.
Yeah, everyone's in the same sandbox these days, and so I think that any infectious disease, unfortunately, is going to get out. So I understand that other countries are going to try and stop it, but I mean, surely it's only a matter of time.
Well, if nothing else, this allows Shari Markson to work on her sequel. So, and that's what the world really wants and needs.
Now, we should, before we kick off into the good stuff, we have an
Mm.
interview this week where we went deep on a fact check, which was, we often hear people say that, News Corp and Rupert Murdoch have a media monopoly, or they have more reach than any other media company in Australia. And the question is that actually true? And I spoke to someone from the ABC RMIT fact check team
Hmm.
who did a really, really in-depth look at the entire News Corp Australia empire, their TV, their radio, their print, their digital, their social media, to try and come up with an understanding to help understand, just how big they are. So we'll be going on to that. But before we do, just a quick bit of housekeeping. First of all, thank you to our patrons who have supported the show. It does mean a lot. If you have a few dollars to kick our way, it helps us with hosting costs and other things. That's patreon.com/Murdocracy, MURDOCRACY.
Absolutely. And I promise I didn't use any of the money for my eye surgery. Absolutely.
And the other thing is, we will be announcing what we'll be doing over our Christmas and New Year's break. And also, I'm getting married early next year, so I will
That's right.
also be out for a little
Congratulations
bit. Yeah.
again.
Yes. We'll have a handle on that sooner rather than later. But we will have plenty of good content for you to feast on over the break.
Absolutely. We're thinking about it hard, and we're going to make sure that everyone has lots of Murdocracy in their ears over the Christmas holidays.
Okay, on to News Corp news of the week. And the first story is News Corp is going to court. The legal entity that runs Sky News, it's called Australian News Channel, is suing media monitoring company Isentia for breaking IP and copyright laws. Here's some of the background according to Mumbrella's Olivia Krumel. So they said since September 1, a competing news monitoring service called Stream has been given the exclusive license to monitor Sky News content. So that means that they're the only one
Mhm.
who are allowed to say, here's if your company was mentioned in our segments.
Which is
Uh,
basically what this is. That's important to kind of break that down. That these services, what they do is, if you're advertising, or if you're, basically want to find out, hey, how many times has my brand or my company or my name personally been mentioned on all of News Corp or all of Channel 7, all of Channel 9, these companies do that monitoring for you.
Yeah, and they're also particularly important in things like politics, so when you're
Hmm.
mentioned. And also, I've used media monitoring companies a lot in journalism. So I can say, it allows you to take that, rather than saying, oh, I think people are talking about this a lot, I can be like, we know that,
Yes.
critical race theory was mentioned this many times up until the 2020 US election,
Hmm.
and then everyone stopped talking about it. It allows you to quantify it. So it is very useful. So at the moment, Stream is the only media monitoring company in Australia that can have content from Sky News Australia, including alerts, streaming, downloads, and transcripts. But Accenture claims that it qualifies for an exemption under the Copyright Act, which allows them to use copyright material for the service of the Crown, as in they have government customers, and
Hmm.
I know many departments use this as well, and they are saying, well, we can monitor what's on Sky News Australia. So, Sammy, how do you feel about the idea of News Corp suing so that someone can't run a business like this, so they know how often they're mentioned on public channels, and handing that exclusively to another company?
Well, It's bizarre given how very recently News Corp learned a hard and embarrassing lesson on the importance of accuracy in media mentions. If you remember, the Australian, the IPA, had published a report by media writer Sophie Ellsworth. This
Mm.
was back in September, saying the ABC discusses News Corp and Murdoch 1,700 times in just 30 days. And when the ABC and other analysts kind of looked into that, it turns out it was things like the mention of the word Murdoch, which included, Murdoch University, the Murdoch Children's Research Center. It included street names that have the last name Murdoch, or just any other thing like that. And so, they were basically quite publicly and embarrassingly pointed out to them that accuracy matters in these things, and being able to monitor news provides valuable data and valuable information. And for the government as well, that's the interesting thing, is that this organization, Isentia, is used by the government, by political parties as well, but also just by government departments. And so this is affecting their contract with them. It'll be interesting to see whether Stream can get the same kind of exclusive contract with government departments, and whether this is another move there. But either way, it's I hope Sophie Ellsworth is using them for her next column. That's all.
I'll let you in on something that that a dealing that I had with Stream, which is I've used the company many times,
Hmm.
and probably shouldn't be saying this just in case it does get back to them. So everyone listening, promise to keep this a secret.
Hmm.
I wanted to do something that was a kind of that based on the words that I was looking for. So I was like, hey, can you figure out how many times it's just mentioned? That was clearly something that was going to be quite critical of News Corp. And I was told that like it would be great if I actually didn't ask them to do that because they didn't want to get in trouble. And this was
Yeah,
a
of
while
course.
ago,
Right.
before they signed the contract. But I'm assuming these things are in motion. And I
Hmm.
guess like like this may have just been I doubt it's a company wide directive, but it does kind of show that when you have a utility that can kind of be restricted to one person, a company can dictate who does this. It allows them to kind of either put certain conditions on them, or at least like have the fear of conditions or that kind of contract being taken away. So
Hmm.
the idea that like this one company now can provide transcripts of what is a major Australian news channel, which would be so important to their business and would mean that Stream to many of their customers would probably seem more attractive because they say, well, we can monitor all the channels and not just everything minus Sky News. But that depends on good relations with the company. So you do end up in a situation where because they have this kind of control over it, it gives them power. So look, I'm not sure that is a super widespread thing, and maybe that was just someone who I was speaking to, kind of
Hmm.
freelancing and just trying to avoid any
Yeah.
unnecessary trouble. But these things have
But it does have an effect,
consequences. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think once everyone figures out that you can just get a corporate account on Otter.ai and connect your TV to that, then anyway, these companies are going to shut down. So who knows?
It's only a matter of time.
Indeed.
So, Media Week's James Manning had a sit down interview with News Corp Australia executive chairman Michael Miller this week. And there was a few interesting tidbits I wanted to give to you,
Mhm.
Sammy. One was Manning wrote, some of the changes Miller used to illustrate the new company is that News Corp is now a top 5 audio publisher and top 5 video distributor. And he also named a bunch of companies which were I'd never heard of before: Medium Rare, Storyation, and Suddenly, which are all different content marketing companies owned by News Corp. And he said they're doing really well. It was crazy to me how many, like again, like the
Mhm.
wide array of services that's under the News Corp umbrella.
Well, that's the interesting thing. The Storyation, for example, and Medium Rare, they companies I've looked into in the past because their work is really interesting. They call themselves journalists. Some of them, they do hire journalists, and I know people who freelanced for them, and basically they create media content for corporates, for different
Mm.
organizations, even for News Corp or something to promote different stories, different publications, different exclusive news, 60 minutes things, etc., etc. So it's one of those things that it shows how News Corp has been able to survive so long by diversifying its interests. One of the big mistakes that so many other news channels or even media moguls do is put all the eggs in just the one basket, whereas the multinational corporations that survive longest and survive best are always spread thinly across multiple areas, and News Corp's done that well.
Yeah, fingers and
Credit to them, unfortunately.
yeah, fingers in so many pies.
Hmm.
This I thought was quite telling. A quote: "While News Corp has reached financial agreements with Meta, which is the former name or is the new name of Facebook, and Google," the quote continues, "Miller said they continue to compete fiercely with both of them and others on the advertising front." I thought it was kind of, like that is speaking to the complexity of this
Hmm.
relationship where they're getting, I mean, to put it bluntly, a shitload of money and a great service from these tech companies, but they're also competing directly against them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the I was trying to think of an example of this where basically it's the John Safran's written a book very recently that came out about how Philip Morris and the other cigarette companies kind of basically are very aggressively selling vaping now as well. And the idea
Mm.
was they'll get you off smoking cigarettes, but they'll get you on vaping, because they know that one thing's trend is going out, so they better be their own competition rather than someone else be their own competition. So this is just smart business practices, I suppose. And as a podcast hoping to make some money, we should learn from them. Really, we need
Absolutely.
to yeah we
We're
need to
getting
come
into
out with
advertising as well.
we need to get into advertising, and then we need to come out with a podcast as well that is critical of our podcast for being what it is and own that. You see.
Gotcha. I think that's what they call vertical integration in the biz. The final quote that was interesting was that some of the print audience didn't want to lose the curation that comes with a newspaper, have found the digital replica editions give them best of both worlds. I have seen those digital replicas, which is essentially the digital version
Yes.
of the newspaper. So not, when you go to a website, you'll see the articles. They also have for subscribers, here is the full physical paper, just in digital form.
It's like a PDF you can zoom in on.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't know anyone used those.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical about this one. I'm assuming, look, maybe there is a very large contingent of aged care facility users, and but I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean genuinely, people like if you run an aged care facility, as opposed to getting a
Okay.
subscription to the Australian, you just get it online, and everyone in the facility is able to, because of reading issues, maybe use the larger fonts and stuff in the digital edition, and that might be where the market for this is. But I don't know. I don't know why that's still better than just going to theaustralian.com.au and reading over there.
Yeah, scrolling through on your iPad, I'm not sure I
Mm.
don't think is the most intuitive. The thing that I think is interesting is like there was a really big push at the start of the digital transition in digital
Hmm.
media to have these physical, digital versions of physical papers. And, in particular, News Corp was actually, and Nine Papers or then Fairfax were kind of big at this idea of like
Yes.
a digital magazine on iPads, a different app and stuff. And it never really worked out. Like, I don't think anyone kind of got into it that much, partly because, like, it's one of those things that when you see a big transformation in an industry, particularly in digital media or in media generally, you'll see people try and replicate the success of a previous like
Hmm.
era on the new format. So you'd be like, oh, like people they want a physical paper on their device, but
Yes.
actually people don't. People want to be able to have hyperlinks and zoom through things and go between stuff. They don't want to have to like scroll past big digital ads of Clive Palmer's United Australia Party or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical about that actually.
Well, it's also interesting when someone at the level that Michael Miller is, keeps things vague, where he just says some of
Mm,
the print audience who don't want to lose. There's no numbers, there's no stats, there's no,
that's
no
true.
further details there. It might just be something like his nephew is in charge of that department, and he doesn't want to make it look bad.
Yeah. On Wednesday, News Corp held its annual award ceremony. Yeah, it has an award ceremony where it
Nothing better
gives.
than giving yourself
I
awards.
know, I know.
Mm.
Isn't that good? We should do the Meritocracy
Oh,
award ceremony.
That is so exciting. I definitely want best guy without glasses award.
Oh man, I feel like I got snubbed.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be our end of year content.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's some of the standout winners that I mean, there was quite a lot of awards, but
Mhm.
some interesting ones. Johannes Leek won the Bill Leek Cartoonist of the Year award. Well,
Mhm.
what a surprise!
Yeah, it was named after his father. He took over as soon as his father died, and I actually, to be in full honesty, own a Johannes League original.
That's right. What is it of?
It is basically when I joined the ABC back in the days of yore. Johannes Leek had done a sketch of me basically walking into this toilet where everyone's writing like communism is the best
Uh huh.
and news and Murdoch sucks and things like that, like showing the ABC to be like this hot spot full of communists and creatives, and me walking in and being given a marker to be told, hey, your toilet is on the left. And it was meant to be an attack on me. I found it really funny, so I contacted him on Instagram. I think he was very new. It was his second or third cartoon, and I said, "Hey, I really like it. Can I buy it?" And he was surprised. He was like, "What? Really?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. I want. And can you sign it?" He's like, "Okay." So he sent it to me, signed it, and I have it framed over my desk now. The time that the Australian and Johannes Leak attack, kind of came after me in a parody way, and I enjoyed it.
I'm surprised, as a avowed communist, that you decided to buy into something in a capitalistic way. But I guess
True, true,
the
true.
first time for everything.
Yes, exactly. I slipped up.
Sam Maiden won
Hmm.
Scoop of the Year for her Brittany Higgins story. Sam Maiden will be one of the people who is in the front running to get a big Walkley Award, which is
Hmm.
Australia's top journalism awards for that story. But she did kind of have a falling out with Brittany Higgins that was like quite public. So it is interesting to see that she kind of keeps getting this scoop. She keeps getting awards for it. She won, I think, a Kennedy Award for it as well. But
Well, yeah, there was a whole thing on Twitter where they had a fight, and then Brittany Higgins kind of distanced herself from Sam Maiden. But then Brittany Higgins published, I think, an apology on Twitter as well. So it's all gone a bit 21st century Twitter spat.
yeah,
But look, I mean, Sam Maiden's coverage of this story was probably one of the biggest stories of 2021. Outside of COVID related issues. So, kudos to her for continuing to get the credit for it.
indeed. And of course, Sherry Markson
Hmm.
won the top gong, the Sir Keith Murdoch Award for her reporting on COVID-19, including her interview with Donald Trump. Do you know, I was thinking something maybe we should do is like,
Hmm.
we should almost do like a director's commentary episode for her 1 hour
That's
COVID
exactly what I
special
was
or
thinking.
something.
Yes.
Some kind of like readers or I guess listeners kind of accompaniment that we can kind of talk people through it. I think there's a rich vein to be tapped there.
Well, definitely, because part of I also want to get my hands on the book now and read through it, because
Mm,
I've read some of the reviews and the criticisms and critiques that have come from a lot of corners is that the scientific analysis is very lacking, and some of the theories jump from plausible into straight into conspiracy. But also, this is such a weird story because if you remember when it started, the idea that this was a lab leak was something that was only coming from the Trump camp, and now
mm.
it's very mainstream. So, yeah, Sherry Markson's kind of coverage on this, uh, it's hard to poo-poo it as much as I'd like to, given the fact that it's become so normalized because of the acceptance from other areas like Biden, even for example.
Yeah, I mean, with all this stuff around the reporting of this, and this is actually just kind of a problem with like reporting in general, right? Is that it's often very hard to tell whether something is like correct or framed in a fair way or not, just
Hmm.
based on what you get. Because the way the journalism works, right, is people get, a journalist gets information from a bunch of places and then decides to cut it down in a way and put it all together that tells a story. That's the most basic way of
Yes.
doing that. But that by its nature means cutting out information, simplifying it, getting rid of some of the noise and just keeping it to the signal. But the issue is that, like, when you read something that's done by someone, you don't know if it's framed sometimes in a very I guess like in a way that maybe confirms their prior beliefs, maybe in a
Hmm.
way that's good for them and that kind of stuff. Like I've seen some criticisms of Shari's reporting on this kind of stuff that seems to imply that not that she's not that she makes things up, she doesn't fabricate things, but it has come at it in a very I guess kind of like almost like tabloidy or very kind of like way that makes things out to be bigger than they actually are. Like an example was there was this, she did she reported on a document that I think was like a 2014 document made by someone who worked at a university in China, talking about the potential to make bioweapons and a as a way of kind of like international dominance and that kind of thing. And there's someone who wrote this document. They work for a university, which means that they the way it is in China means that they would have close links to the Chinese government. And that is like, oh, you're like, wow, that like sounds to be, pretty like telling, they're talking about this. But then I saw other people who reported on it following it, which is like, this is like almost like a fanfic made by like one lecturer outside of his work, has no like real basis. No one's ever kind of backed it up. Like he's essentially no one. But then was like presented in the way of like being this like, official document. So like, I find it very hard to know what to think about her reporting sometimes, because I'll put it this way, like, the stuff when I've seen it, when I've seen it critiqued by people who do dive into it, often finds out that it's not that she's lying, it's not that she's wrong, it's just presented in a way that gives an impression that's almost like misleading and dishonest, that kind of confirms her this broader like narrative, which she seems to be like saying that China has had a really big role in creating the coronavirus in some way, whether it was the idea of a bioweapon, which is, I think, pretty fantastical, but more likely, like it could have potentially come out of a lab leak, and then
the gain of function lab leak.
Exactly. And like, everything that she reports on kind of feeds back to that. So I find it very hard to trust.
Well, regardless, she's award-winning.
Exactly,
And whether you trust her or not, she's making space on her mantelpiece right now to put that award up there. So, that's just jealousy talking. Cam, is
That's
what it
true.
is.
That's true. Well, I feel snubbed. I didn't even get shortlisted for the Sir Keith Murdoch Award. So I have to pick up my game for next year. And Sami, a few weeks ago, we spoke about the News Corp's global third quarter earnings, and we've been pretty interested in how the money works in this podcast. One detail we mentioned but didn't speak about too much was their stock buyback.
Yes.
This week, the Australian Financial Review's Miriam Robin asked, where is the buyback? In the month since the earnings, they've spent just about $12 million of the promised $1 billion of buyback, which means that, essentially they haven't really done anything at all. Now, Sami, how well acquainted are you with the idea of stock buybacks?
Well, I know the basic function behind it, which is that it's when the company repurchases their own shares of stocks, right? And especially when they have extra cash.
Yeah.
And some of the reasons around it are just reinvestment in the company, repurchasing of the shares allow, a kind of a bit of undervaluation can also take place that way, boosting their own finance, and just basically using cash that's lying around. It's a good way of making sure that cash doesn't just sit and go unused. But
it's burning a hole in your pocket.
Exactly, and they can only buy so many media content creation companies in Australia. But why they're delaying it and everything, I'm not sure. I don't know what's Miriam Robin's thesis on why they are not doing the buyback that they said they would.
Well, when you're buying back stock, you're just like any, Joe Random on the stock market buying it. And so, when you say, I want to buy back stock, that means you also might want to wait for a good time. You say, we're going to buy it at some point, but we're not going to say when, because, okay, like we've discussed before, their stock's doing quite well on, international stock markets. And so, you don't want to buy it when it's at its most expensive. You want to buy it when it's lower. And so that means it's better for you. And, my understanding of how the stock buybacks work is that, you've got this money, and what you do is you buy the stock. And so essentially that means that you're almost like burning those stock in a way. Everyone else who owns stock, what they own becomes more valuable, because there's less stock in circulation. So, like shareholders love it because it just means that, I don't have to do anything and my stock inherently becomes more valuable. There is a bit of a criticism about it, which is that although, in the short term, it boosts stock price because inherently something you've got is more scarce. The flip side is that you're not actually investing it in something like R&D. You're not improving what you're doing. And
Right.
so by doing that, you're having a short term like sugar hit, but you're really not actually improving the company in the long term. I think it is like, I'm not like super au fait with all this stuff. I don't know
Hmm.
it super well, but it is like, I find it fascinating to hear about, well, as this big company who's got arms all over the world, and I'm sure heaps of people are always saying I could use more money to do something. They've decided the best thing for their shareholders, for the people who own their company, is just to make them a little bit more rich.
Okay. Well, I'm glad they're getting more rich. That's basically, good for them. Everyone deserves a Christmas present. And it's time now, of course, for good news scope, bad news scope, where we look at the best news scope story of the week and the potentially worst news scope story of the week. And my good news scope this week is a editorial column in the Weekend Australian, published last weekend, really, but I just got around reading it now. It's by Helen Trinker.
Hmm.
And Helen Trinker, for those who don't know, is the Deal editor and associate editor, and it is headlined "Why Do Men Feel the Need to Flaunt Their Junk?" And it is, if you wanted to read a very long essay in the Australian about why men continue to send dick pics, particularly focused around Tim Paine and his dick
Mm.
pic, but just dick pics overall. And the word penis appearing many times in a column, and penis pic and references to penis pictures, and going all the way back to ancient Roman graffiti to Tim Paine's most recent modern indulgence. It's a fun read. I'll give it that much. It's a fun read. There's some great lines in it. You might have individual concerns about what the behavior represents, but is it society's business? Well, yes, it is. And not just because the traffic in penis pics is all a bit unseemly, a bit low rent compared to the passion possibilities offered by sex, or even the more prosaic versions of a long term relationship. It's just, it's just fun, like bizarre column like that. And I was surprised to have read it in the Weekend Australian. So credit to them for publishing that.
Ah, that's good. I've found the Tim Paine thing to be like, I mean, like, I'm assuming we don't have all the details about it,
Hmm.
but like I mean, so we don't know why Cricket Australia investigated him sending sexting and essentially like sexually harassing someone who it does seem like he had a kind of like inappropriate relation with non almost like business relationship with them already, but like it
Hmm.
seemed like he stepped over the line. I just find it bizarre that like they went through this investigation, they found that he had done no wrongdoing. I mean, I don't know what they considered, but they found that, but then they suspended him, and now I think he stepped down from the team altogether when it
Yeah.
became public. Like, either you decide that it's okay or it's not, but it shouldn't matter whether it goes public, right?
Well, that seems to be the big controversy around it as well. A lot of people have pointed out the reaction from Cricket Australia seems to be a bit vague as to why they've done what they've done, forced his hand in the way that they did, and especially since he and his family seem to have dealt with it ages ago.
Hmm.
It's not a recent thing. What I really like though is that this column has 500 and let's see, how many does it have right now? 573 comments.
It's a
And
conversation starter.
and most of those comments are, well, women do it too.
Come
So,
on. All right. Not all
you
men.
know, right, yeah, that plague of women sending pictures and naughty bits to just everyone on
Oh,
Instagram and
yeah.
Twitter and
I'm sick
everything.
of it. I'm inundated. I'm like,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
thank you.
absolutely.
I'm about to get married. I can't say that. Hey, on bad news corp,
Hmm.
I the one that struck my eye this week was a story by James Morrow, who is the Daily Telegraph's political editor, and I think political editor is an important part of this.
Hmm.
He got a story, an exclusive, about a Chinese naval ship near Australian waters that had been there for 3 weeks, apparently, monitoring what was happening on Australia's shores. So, seen as a kind of military kind of operation, and seen as a rise in kind of international tensions. Why I thought it was a bad news corp is, to me, it just stunk of this idea of a drop. Sammy, you know what a drop is, right?
Hmm.
So a drop is when a politician gives a kind of exclusive story on something to a journalist. And like sometimes I guess there are kind of arguments for it, but we do see that, like, very often
It's fairly common, yeah.
it's fairly common. But I guess the idea is, like, very often politicians will kind of create a very favorable relationship with a certain journalist who will write up their stories in a kind of very positive way in return for these kinds of exclusive stories. And why I found it interesting and why I'm calling this a bad story is because, so this story is
Hmm.
kind of like raising the temperature on Australian-Chinese relations. It was also to James Morrow, who, I don't know if you've read much of his writing, but I would say he's much closer to, I mean, like, he's less worried about like war and more about like the culture wars, if you know what I
Yes,
mean. Like,
that's right.
it's not like he's a well-sourced person in intelligence and defense communities. No, I'm pretty certain he just got a drop from the office of Peter Dutton, who the same day had a National Press Club address where he was also talking up tensions with China. And so to me, it was just like, it was such an example of, like, this manipulation of Australian discourse by by government releasing favorable stories. And by favorable, I mean things that are trying to create the narrative they want at right times to people who write them up in a very, like, straightforward, in the way that they want, in order to kind of shift debate in a way that they want.
Well, it's just there's a Kevin Roth's commentary around that was also noteworthy in the piece that you posted, because he I think retweeted and said, "What a coincidence! On the very day Dutton speaks at the press club, Murdoch's front pages deliver screaming exclusive. Neither Murdoch nor Dutton intervened to stop Morrison over the Port of Darwin sale to China." It is one of those stories which clearly Peter Dutton's been pushing a certain agenda, pushing a certain story in the media, in the press, very aggressively. And I'm not even going to say to distract from the fact that he just won a $350,000 thing against Shane Bazzi. It's just his role as defense minister, he feels, is very much focusing on China.
I
And
think it's an election thing. Like, I
yeah,
think it's pretty, like, obviously that this government is trying to make China relations a really big part of this election. And we saw ScoMo have this weird comment calling, like, essentially implying that Albo was like a China sympathizer, which is, you're getting into this real, like, McCarthyism. Like, yes, we know China is is a foreign nation that's been using its powers in
mhm.
pretty dodgy ways. But the way to answer it isn't to try and make this into a political, domestic political issue. It's to have well thought out international relations and clever diplomacy. That's not what this is about. This, to me, just feels like they're ringing the racism bell to try and win an election.
Well, let's see if it works. It's not like Daily Telegraph readers are the ones who need convincing anyway. They're usually of one mind when it comes to these issues. So yeah.
So now we're joined by David Campbell, who is a senior researcher and journalist at RMIT ABC Fact Check, who wrote a exhaustive and very interesting, and I think it's sometimes challenging, fact check about how big Rupert Murdoch and News Corp's influence and reach is in Australia. And I wanted to get him on to bring him through all of it. So David, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
So maybe first of all, before we get into your really systemic look and working through an understanding of how big the News Corp reach is, did you see, like, a lot of different claims, and what are the claims about how big the reach is?
Yeah, well, I suppose something to put out there first is a lot of the claims you see about Murdoch and News Corp are around influence, and that is something that really is very, very hard to measure. So that's why we took a look at reach, and really what we were interested in here was, who is actually consuming, news stories produced by Murdoch's brands, various news brands. So yeah, I mean, I think you'll see some people arguing that they have a monopoly on news, which is, I think, overstating the case by quite a long way. But yeah, realistically, like, a lot of the claims are just around them being very dominant, and the data really, I think, shows that they are certainly one of the biggest players in the Australian media landscape. but saying exactly, who is number one is a bit of a tricky business.
How do you measure something like this?
Yeah, with a bit of difficulty. Unfortunately, there's no sort of single.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. I will therapize about the fact check that I wrote, but yeah, like realistically, there's no one measure um, that sort of brings together all the various pieces of the media landscape. So it is quite tricky to be able to, yeah, say, put a single figure on it. Um, so yeah, what we've looked at is reach, and what we're talking about is the number of individual people who are, reached, who consume media and news media in particular. And the way we had to approach that is to look at this kind of fractured media landscape. So we're looking at newspapers, and then you can look at news websites, and then awkwardly there are ways to measure newspapers and their websites, but not online only news sources. and then you
Mm.
and then you get into broadcast, and it becomes quite difficult to compare, say, free to air TV with subscription TV, which is where you see Sky News Australia operating. And then you have radio, and then of course social media is a whole different beast again, and you have all the various platforms there. So yeah, really, when you're talking about measuring the reach of News Corp, you're talking about their reach within these distinct, well, sometimes distinct, sometimes overlapping categories of media.
What about the different arms? You just went through it just then about the
Yeah.
different mediums that they're in as well. Is the kind of print journalism and I guess the digital text journalism that's associated with it, is that still really the heart of News Corp in Australia?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I mean, it is certainly like that. I think is where they like in print, they absolutely dominate. Uh, and when it comes to online, they are a big fish, and so there's more competition there. But then, yeah, when you're moving into sort of pure online and into social media, I think that's really where they are killing it at the moment. So again, it's difficult to say exactly kind of what the influence might be that results from the reach, but on social media, YouTube and Facebook, um, you know, Sky News is reaching millions and millions of people.
And one of the difficulties that I'm sure you came across, or I know that you did, is of course when you look at stuff like Sky News and digital, social media metrics, that's
Mm.
also not even limited to influence in Australia because those audiences by their nature are international. And usually when people are talking about the influence and reach of a company, they tend to still think pretty domestic, whereas these are not.
Yeah, that's right. You can't just like draw a neat border around Australia when you're talking about the audience when on social media. Uh, and yeah, so looking at YouTube, I mean, they've got hundreds of millions of views every month, and yeah, there's like it's very difficult for us to say where those views are coming from. There was reporting to show that about a third of News Corp's website traffic was coming from overseas. So obviously it's slightly different to YouTube and to Facebook, but I think that does indicate that they've got a reach that's far beyond Australia. And yeah, there's going to be a big chunk of people coming from overseas. And I mean, I actually revisited before this interview, I went back and had a look at the YouTube statistics to see where they're at now. And in the last 9 months, Sky has actually doubled the number of views that it gets each
Ooh.
month. So it was actually already sitting at. So I looked at this in March, and it was sitting at 760 million views a month, which was about 260 million more than the ABC. The numbers now is 1.3 billion, which
Ooh.
kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
So to me, that speaks to a bigger audience than Australia alone. But obviously, we don't know how many people are watching videos more than once, that sort of thing. And maybe there's a sort of level of intensity when you get into a certain crowd. I don't know. But yeah, they are some big numbers.
Yeah, that was the thing that actually was surprising me recently, which is you reference in your piece something that I wrote about a year ago,
Yeah.
which was about Sky News Australia, and I was saying they've made this digital transformation, and I guess I'm going to pat myself on the back. Like, I was like I think I was one of the first people to really notice that this was happening.
Yeah.
And it's a year since that's happened, and it feels crazy because this whole awareness of it has really grown. There's been heaps more reporting, like, other than me, and more attention that's kind of happened since then. But they've continued this incredible growth. Like, it wasn't like they're plateaued; they're like even bigger. And at the time, I wouldn't have imagined that. But I guess that just speaks to, I guess, their ability to perfect what they're doing and to reach new audiences, and I guess the enormous possible audiences out there when your audience truly is global.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you just look at the chart, it's just going up and up and up, which is not the case with with some of the other local news outlets. And if you're looking, specifically at YouTube, it's not that, say, Channel 7 and Channel 9 aren't going up, but they are just not even in the same ballpark.
Yeah. Was there anything that really surprised you when you were pulling this all together?
Um, that's a good question.
I'm asking you to throw your mind back a couple of months now.
Yeah. Look, I suppose I wasn't hugely surprised by what I was seeing with with newspapers, and perhaps even with news websites. But so when we were talking about, so we're talking particularly about Sky News before, and social media, and so I was aware of, yes, your reporting, showing just how big their numbers were there. I think what surprised me, but was actually then going back to broadcast and seeing, uh, relatively speaking, that Sky News, didn't have the biggest audience. That their reach is so outsized on social media compared to what they're putting out on their TV network. So yeah, I found that fascinating because, I mean, really, like, if you look, I guess the issue with broadcast is that you're competing with free to air news as well. And so if you look at some studies like Canberra University puts out its annual digital news report, they were looking at where people get their news from, and they found that I think it was 12% of news consumers got their news from Sky News. But then if you look at Channel 9 and 7, it's like 38%. ABC TV is 33%. I mean, this is purely talking broadcast, so obviously there's more to it. But then, yeah, like, they're absolutely dwarfed there. So yeah, I suppose the disparity was the real thing that shocked me.
Yeah, that's something that I am kind of surprised by, is just how much traditional media still has an enormous audience. Because, when people are talking about digital media, they're talking about the potential of, like, something going viral and getting millions and millions of views, and that's really exciting. But I think that, like, almost like the excitement of that takes away from the fact that, like, broadcast traditional media, like the 7 p.m. news, still racks up, like, consistently, like, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of viewers every single night. Like, it may, like, it might be declining, I think, slightly, and it may not be as buzzy, but, like, it's almost like it doesn't get the attention because it's not as new and shiny as social media. But
Yeah.
it is still enormous, and particularly that's, like, comparing terrestrial television, so free to air, to pay television, which remains still pretty niche.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, TV still, tops the list, when you're looking at where people get their news from. Like, I guess it's become, that's normal, and so when you're comparing it, to the new thing, like, everything else sort of seems shocking and big. But then, I mean, social media really has, like, jumped a long way, though. I mean, there are 50% of people now getting at least some of their news from social media, and I think 20% of people use it as their main source of news. So I suppose there is a story there, a big story. But yeah, there's still 60 odd percent, 50 odd percent of people who are getting their news from television every night. So yeah, don't forget, I guess, the sort of the basics.
David, gun to your head, and I know that you're going to hate this.
What's your favorite news?
Just try to pick just one. No, I want to ask. Based on this, and I know you just looked at News Corp specifically, but I'm sure you took other stuff in as well. Is News Corp the Australian media company with the most reach?
Yeah, I guess I can't give you a definitive answer.
Sorry,
It's
I
very
know, I
sad.
put you on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
spot.
yeah. Classic fact-checking move. But yeah, you know, I can give you a couple of stats. Say from newspapers and from news websites. So if you're looking at news websites, as far as individual websites, the ABC, when we looked, this was in sort of December 2020, the ABC pulled in a little over 11 million users per month. 9.com.au had 10.7 million, and news.com.au had 10 million, and that's News Corp's number one performer when it comes to news websites. And if you look at the overall reach for the companies, Nine Entertainment has 13 odd million per month, News has 12 and a bit, and the ABC has a bit over 11. So it's not, they're not miles ahead. They're sort of sitting in the middle there amongst the big players. But of course, there's still an offline audience component to that doesn't consider. So when you're looking at newspapers, the print audience that you get for News Corp is about 2.6 million readers per week on average, and that compares to 1.2 million for Nine Entertainment's three newspapers, so The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, and the Financial Review. So it's actually, they have more than double the weekly reach. When you're looking at the big, the national and capital city dailies. So you need to be able to somehow put those numbers together really to get a sense of who comes out on top. And then, of course, when you get into broadcast, Channel 9, Channel 7 are big players there, along with ABC. And so even if News Corp was ahead, I would expect they would fall behind there in terms of total reach. So, who can say? I suppose it depends on which area you want to look
Yeah.
at. And yeah, I suppose which areas you might give more importance. And I think that is like a bit of a tricky space. And there are some good arguments in there. I mean, Kevin Rudd has argued that, if you dominate in print, then that's the ball game, because so many stories, whether they're broadcast, whether they're online, they start in print. And, that's an argument that, I can't sort of give you an answer to, like being right or not, but there's a lot to consider. And also, I think you have other academics. I think Rod Tiffin is one of them, who makes this point that it's the way that you use all the different aspects of your company. And so he makes the argument that there's if a story is picked up in one arm of the company, on TV, that can be repeated through, a column, that can be picked up on social media, and all those things work together to amplify the message. So, it's how you use it, I guess. it's the argument I'm making there.
So in terms of fact checking it, the answer is there's something in there for everyone.
And that's right. Yeah. There's a lot of words in there, so I encourage you to read it.
No, I do highly recommend it as well. And I do think it is kind of, it's important to make it as clear as, you can talk about literally how many eyeballs people are reaching. And then even that is kind of, murky and through different sectors. But then beyond that, it's how News Corp and other media companies use it and coordinate. And I guess it's not the size, but it's how you use it.
Put it on a t-shirt. But yeah, I think that I guess in the end there's a sort of qualitative aspect that is hard to quantify. Yeah, and I suppose that it depends on your view of these different companies, as to whether or not, if they're all equal, but one of them you think is not using its influence fairly, then you're going to have more of a problem with that. So I think that you bring in these various other arguments that go beyond the numbers, which are all interesting, but things that are a bit harder for a fact checker to cover.
Indeed. Well, David, thank you so much for bringing some facts to the debate, which I think can often end up being, quite emotional, and for good reason. But it's nice to be able to say, well, at least we can understand these things. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And use that to kind of guide discussion. So I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for your time, David.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
that was David Campbell from ABC RMIT Fact Check. He's a senior researcher and journalist there who was very kind with his time to talk us through quite a complicated thing. All right, that is us for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, just about anywhere. And you can join our podcast group on Facebook at Murdocracy Podcast. And a reminder, we have a Patreon. That's patreon.com/Murdocracy.
And thank you, of course, to Natalie Sikolovska, our producer, Kevin MacLeod for the theme music, the ABC for the recordings from the archive, Rubinus for our artwork, and of course, thank you to you, Cam.
Thank you, Sammy.